So, we're going to break down an argument that kicks off with a viral meme and ends up challenging pretty much everything the West thinks it knows about homosexuality. This is all about a forbidden question, some serious cultural taboos, and a major global political clash. All right, so this is it. This is the question that kind of kicked this whole thing off, from a 2012 Ugandan TV interview that went viral for just how blunt it was. The source we're looking at here argues that this really simple question, why are you gay, has basically become forbidden to ask in the West. And that, right there, is where this whole argument gets started. You know, what's interesting is that the source frames that original interview as, well, surprisingly polite, a huge contrast to how this topic gets handled in the West. The idea here is that the conversation in Uganda was actually open, but in the West? Nope. That debate is considered completely settled. And yeah, in the West, the answer you're supposed to give is you're born that way. Simple as that. That's all about genetics. But here's the thing. The source argues that even though everyone accepts this, almost nobody can actually explain the science behind it. And if you even try to question it, you're immediately shut down, labeled a bigot. So this whole thing isn't just some abstract cultural debate. Oh no. It blew up into a massive global issue back in 2023 when Uganda passed this new anti-homosexuality law. This sparked a huge ideological and political showdown with Western governments and major institutions. Okay, so you really got to pay attention to how the source sets this up. On the one hand, it describes Uganda's law as being super narrow, right? Targeting only specific criminal acts it labels aggravated homosexuality. But on the other hand, it shows the West reaction as this just total unified condemnation that labels the entire law as a human rights disaster. So you can see the source is pointing out a huge disconnect in how each side is even defining the problem. And this quote is used to drive that point home. The message? There was zero debate in the U.S. It was a complete bipartisan agreement, from President Biden all the way to Senator Ted Cruz, that this law was just plain wrong, an attack on human rights. And according to the source, the consequences were, well, devastating. It claims that once the World Bank and the U.S. hit Uganda with sanctions and cut off aid, the country fell into a famine. The argument being made is a direct line. The West's moral stance led directly to kids starving. All right, so now let's get to the real heart of the argument, which is a full-on challenge to that core Western belief we talked about, this idea that homosexuality is just an innate trait you're born with. And this quote from American politician Pete Buttigieg is presented as like the perfect example of the born this way argument. The idea that, hey, this isn't my choice, my creator made me this way. But right away, the source pushes back against that whole idea with a really simple question, using some pretty interesting demographic data to suggest the biological explanation just doesn't quite add up. And yeah, this chart right here, it really shows you what they're talking about. You're seeing a more than 300% jump in young people identifying as non-heterosexual in just about a decade. And the argument is pretty straightforward. A biological trait, something in your DNA, just doesn't spread that quickly through a population. It doesn't make sense. But it doesn't stop there. The source claims that this whole born this way idea wasn't some scientific breakthrough. It was actually a public relations strategy cooked up back in the 80s. The alleged goal? To reframe homosexuality as an unchangeable identity, just like race, and to shift the entire public conversation to be about the idea of love. Okay, so if it's not genetics, then what is it? Well, the source puts forward a totally different theory, one that's all about psychology and your personal history. And this is really the key. The guest in the interview, Milo Yiannopoulos, completely redefines what homosexuality even is. He's arguing it's not who you are, it's a symptom. It's a set of behaviors that come from some kind of deep-seated, identifiable trauma. So what kind of trauma are we talking about? Well, the source points again and again to a specific set of common factors it claims you see in the backgrounds of many gay men. Things like overbearing mothers, fathers who are absent or abusive, and even sexual trauma. The argument is that these environmental factors are the real root causes. Okay, so then the argument zooms way out, from the individual person to society as a whole. The claim here is that the West hasn't just, accepted homosexuality. It's actually made promoting it a central moral value, and that's had huge effects on the culture. And with this really provocative quote, the source tries to make a specific point. The argument isn't that society is becoming more feminine, but that it's adopting a very specific set of values and behaviors that the source ties directly to homosexuality.
And this is the kind of evidence the source points to for this big societal shift. Yiannopoulos points to things like, rampant consumerism driven by people without kids who have more money to spend. He talks about addiction becoming mainstream, this manufactured ugliness you see in high fashion, and just a general feeling that our culture is, well, uncreative and conformist. So, after all that, we're left with this really fundamental question that the source is asking. What happens when the thing a society decides to worship is also the very thing that's causing massive conflict both at home and abroad? According to the source, that's the crisis the West is in right now.